Today on episode 20 of the Missionary Coach Show, we'll be continuing our Missionary Stories series with reading chapter 12 of the Rudy Lack's book called Breaktrhrough. This chapter is called Multiplication. So in full-time Christian missions since 1999, I'm your missionary coach, Bill Hutchison. This is the show where we talk about all things missions related, from preparations, travel, training, relationships, building a support network, testimonies, stories, and more. You can find more about what I do by heading over to missionarycoach.org. Now, I do apologize for missing a couple of weeks actually of recording this show. At one point I was unable to actually log on to the online copy of the book, so kind of hard to read the book when I don't have access to the book other than the physical copy, but it's a lot easier if I can actually, when I'm streaming it, to put it online for you guys to see too. And then last week I was having a lot of trouble with my recording device. So I've actually ordered a replacement recording device. We'll see how this one goes tonight. I should actually be monitoring my speaking to make sure. All right. I think we're good. I look like a dork, but that's all right. I look like a dork tonight with the headphones on just so I can monitor it. And then hopefully moving forward, we won't have these technical glitches. Now, if you do want to stick around after the end of the reading, I'm going to share a video and audio that I recorded about developments that are happening with the YM News Show, which I have been producing since 2010. So let's get this started. All right, so this chapter is called Multiplication. We'll continue reading Rudy Lack's book. Here we go, Multiplication. Like corks bobbing in the water, it is sometimes easy to think of one's life as being pulled by the currents of human desire and circumstance. We make decisions that initially appear to have no significance. In hindsight, however, these prove to be major turning points. Not only do we realize that, in fact, all along God has been prodding and directing those apparently inconsequential choices to steer us in the right direction. Such is the case in my choice to go to Rhodesia today, named Zimbabwe. I had visited 7 different African countries: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Ethiopia, and South Africa. These were all nations where our short-term teams had been operating. When someone suggested I visit Rhodesia, my underlying motive for going was somewhat carnal. I would give me a chance to notch up yet another country in my African belt. I was visiting the team in Zambia at the time. From where we were staying, we could view Rhodesia. I was standing at the window, looking out across the border, when someone remarked, "You should make a trip there, Rudy." That sparked the idea, and I used the visit to the Scriptural Gift Mission as my excuse for going. Based in the capital, Salisbury, the mission had been supplying our team with literatures for some time. The elderly lady in charge kindly invited me to stay at her home. We were enjoying fellowship over the evening meal, discussing the philosophy of YWAM and how our vision was to motivate young people into missions, when she said to me, her eyes sparkling, "Rudy, you need to meet Gary Strong. He is a key leader in our country. I believe he's someone who could help you." "I'd love to," I said. I was eager to make acquaintances with anyone who would help get YWAM launched in Rhodesia. "He's a busy man, but I'll ring him right away and check if he can see you tomorrow." So it was arranged. I would meet with this Gary Strong, a Methodist minister, the next afternoon. Situated in the 3rd story of an inner-city commercial block, Gary's premises had the appearance more of a successful business than a church office. As I entered the simple but tastefully decorated room, an auburn-haired man, who I guessed to be in his early 40s, stood up from behind the modest, polished wooden desk and came to greet me. "Welcome to the Rhodesia," he said, giving me a firm handshake and directing me to one of 2 stylish leather chairs that graced his office. We were soon chatting like old friends. I was immediately impressed by his positive manner. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on me as I told him our desire to recruit young people into missions. "Does YWAM run schools?" he asked. "Yes, we do," I replied, referring to the SOEs operating out of Switzerland. "We have a 3-month training school followed by a practical 2-month outreach." Gary leaned back in his chair, his hands behind his head, sighed deeply. "Well, we certainly need such training schools here in Rhodesia, and I know just the place where you could hold it." Without giving me time to explain that Switzerland was the only country where SOEs were held, he rose from his chair. Going over to his desk, he pressed the button on his flip-up phone book and scanned the list for a number. I opened my mouth to explain these schools were held only in Switzerland, and we had no plans to hold one in Africa. But he already had his phone off the hook and was dialing a number. "I'll make arrangements to take you to see the facility," he said, holding the phone to his ear as it rang the other end. "It's a holiday retreat center, and it would be ideal." Before I knew it, Gary had organized for me to visit the facility later that same afternoon. Situated 10 kilometers from Salisbury, the retreat center, or rest haven as it was called, was indeed a beautiful facility. Really, it was a small village set in a sweeping valley. Run by an interdenominational foundation, the buildings were surrounded by well-kept gardens, complete with swimming pool, walkways meandering through native bush, where an occasional monkey could be seen swinging from branch to branch. The center had individual bungalows for accommodation, a chapel, and smaller rooms that were usually used for seminars, but which would be ideal for classrooms. As I walked around taking it all in, something stirred within me. In my mind's eye, I could see young people sitting at the desks, studying God's Word, much as we had in Lausanne, and then going out into surrounding nations to share the message of Christ's love. The idea of running schools was not an entirely new notion. After 2 years recruiting short-term outreach teams from abroad, I realized the need for a permanent YWAM base, and had already toyed with the possibility of running an SOE here in Africa. But it had seemed unrealistic. It did not have the staff. I had no finance, and I did not have a suitable facility, at least not until now. We had completed a tour of the grounds and buildings, and I was standing in the reception area reading some of the Rest Haven's brochures. Gary was in another room, talking with the manager. I looked up from the glossy pictures through the open door at the well-manicured gardens with its array of buildings and surrounding woodlands inside. It certainly was a perfect place for a training school, even the extra bonus of the swimming pool. Suddenly, Gary broke into my thoughts. "It's available for 3 months during the low season, January through March," he said, a slight breathlessness in his voice, "and at a very reasonable price, too." I looked at him, a little stunned by his dynamic salesman type style of operating. He definitely was not one to let grass grow under his feet. "That's fabulous," I said, but careful not to commit myself. To run a school would be a major undertaking. I needed to know this was of God and not just a good idea of Rudy Lack or Gary Strong. I left the retreat center that afternoon with all the pamphlets and information I would need to operate a training school in Rhodesia. But I refrained from making any final decision. The implications of taking such a step were too great. Now, if you're watching live, it's dropping in and out a lot. Not sure if that's an internet problem or a computer problem, but I will actually upload a non-dropped version to Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube after the fact. It'll have this section cut out as well as all of the problems, I guess, that we're having. I'd love to know what's causing it. If you are watching right now, if you want to drop a message to let me know what you're seeing. From my end, I keep seeing OBS disconnect, OBS reconnect. So I'll need to get that fixed for next week, because next week we're going to have a co-host for the YM News Show, which should be exciting. But we'll see what we can get working tonight. But yeah, we'll upload the non-scary, the non-messy version, so you can check that out if you're not watching live. So, where were we? That's fabulous, I said, but careful not to commit myself. To run a school would be a major undertaking. I needed to know this was of God and not just a good idea of Rudy Lack or Gary Strong. I left the retreat center that afternoon with all the pamphlets and information I would need to operate a training school in Rhodesia, but I refrained from making any final decision. The implications of taking such a step were too great. During the 2 years I've been organizing outreaches into Africa, we had based our operation from the mission station at Kisumu. This was my first visit to Rhodesia. While I felt an immediate rapport with Gary, I knew that if I came to run a school here, I would need to make a long-term commitment. In order to stay in Rhodesia, it was necessary for me to become a resident. With the facilities at Rest Haven, the facilities at Rest Haven were virtually being handed to me on a plate, and, as Gary had rightfully assessed, would make an ideal base for an African SOE, I was not sure I was ready to make that kind of commitment. I returned to Germany in June 1972 to participate in the Olympic Games outreach in Munich, the one Don Stevens had conceived during our SOE, and which had taken 2 years to prepare. God had miraculously provided a castle at Herlack, an hour's drive from Munich, and it was this stone fortification that housed the 1,000 young people who assembled for the occasion. It proved a trendsetter for outreaches YWAM would organize in the future to coincide with other major international events. The Games outreach elevated YWAM's status. Rather than a fringe organization of radical young Jesus freaks that some churches had perceived us, through this outreach we proved ourselves to be a responsible and internationally respected mission. Now, Youth of the Mission is still running outreaches to every Olympic that I've been a part of. When I was up in YWAM Townsville, we did a huge one to the to the Olympics in Sydney. I was leading an outreach team in East Timor at the time, so didn't participate in the Olympic outreach. But there were hundreds of teams or hundreds of people that came and descended on Sydney for that time, which was pretty exciting. So yeah, YWAM continues to do it, which is really just a fantastic thing and really exciting to see. Sorry, it's still dropping, and I'm trying to figure out why. I think it's because it's using Wi-Fi. That's the problem. Let's change that. My Wi-Fi shouldn't even be on. All right. Let me just change that. Like I said, I'm going to upload better copies. Wi-Fi off. All right. Now, let's see if we're more stable now that we're using the plugged-in network. All right. So, yeah, YWAM's outreaches to Olympic Games and other like Commonwealth Games and stuff around the world is really just amazing to see. Like dozens of teams. This month with Youth of the Mission, we're praying for our arts ministries, and so many people from the arts ministries go to the Olympic outreaches and the large events around the world where they can just really connect with people and use arts to connect. And so that's just an exciting thing that YWAM's continuing to do after these first ones that they did in Munich. So let's keep reading. Initially, we had planned a Jesus march through Munich, but the German authorities were concerned about possible crowd disturbance, so they withdrew permission at the last minute. Then God turned the tragedy of the terrorist Arab attacks, in which 11 Israelis, 5 Arabs, and 1 German were killed, into a triumph. The authorities not only relented on their hardline approach and allowed us to march along our original inner-city route, they even provided us with flowers so that we could hand them out to the mourners who lined the Munich streets. Following the outreach in August, YWAM staff, who now numbered around 100, met in a castle at Rudy for a conference. The Games outreach had been a watershed experience, and each of us had been stirred with renewed passion by the exciting, action-filled days that we had experienced. As we sat together under the open rafted roof of the newly restored castle attic, which only days earlier had been crowned with rows of airbeds and sleeping bags, Lauren reminded us of a YWAM's vision for waves of young people to spread across the world. He challenged everybody about the need to multiply. We've seen our mighty wave with these games, but we can't afford to rest on our laurels. One wave is retreating, but we must be prepared for the next even greater thrust forward. That thrust, as the conference revealed, was a multiplication of new SOEs. We were at the height of the hippie movement when young people were being swept into the kingdom through the Jesus movement. Many were coming with screwed-up backgrounds and, unlike those who attended our SOE, had very little knowledge of the fundamentals of Christianity. I sat amazed at the different staff members began to share their vision for the future. Many had a desire to start a school in their area of service. Joe Portali wanted to commence one in France. David and Carol Boyd were eager to use the castle here in Urlac as a base for the NSOE. And Dawn and Dion Stevens were planning to continue running schools in Lausanne. Although she did not have a vision to start a school, Riona had a burden to expand her teaching ministry and instruct the upcoming crop of young Christians in the ways of God. As I listened to each one share, I got more and more excited. It was a relief to know that in thinking of operating a school in Rhodesia, I was not heading up a side tributary. If I went ahead, I would be flowing with the mainstream of where the rest of YWAM was heading. What about you, Rudy? Lauren asked, turning to me. What are your thoughts for the future? After weeks of procrastination, I'd finally made up my mind. I'm going to start a school in Rhodesia. My decision had been made and my course was set. Some seemingly insurmountable barriers, however, still needed to be dismantled before we could proceed. The most pressing was my need of finance. I had worked out that I would require a minimum of 2,000 Swiss francs to get a school off the ground. But large as that sum appeared, I was confident of God's provision. He had already amazingly provided for the printing of literature, while a German businessman had recently donated 10,000 Deutschmarks to buy a van. Surely, with that record, I could believe God to come up with a mere 2,000 Swiss francs for the Rhodesian SOE. As I preached and shared my vision for the school in various churches around Europe, as well as back in my stomping grounds of Switzerland, where the people had always been so supportive, I fully expected the money to come in. I was sure I would easily have the 2,000 Swiss francs in hand before I returned to Africa in October. But although everyone seemed interested and wished me all the best in my future plans and even promised to pray, only a tiny portion of my school budget had been supplied. Although I had the generous donation to purchase a van, I left Europe with virtually no other funds in hand. I still did not have any staff, and as yet not a single student had been recruited. All I had was a clear conviction that Jesus had called me to start the school. At the Olympic Games, I had reunited with Brother Andrew. He was planning a 12-city evangelistic campaign in South Africa later that year, and invited me to assist him in praying for people after the meeting. So instead of flying directly to Rhodesia after my time in Europe, I flew to South Africa via Nairobi. There, as well as meeting up with a small YWAM team who had set up a permanent base, I also purchased a second-hand white Volkswagen van for the use of our new school. One of the Nairobi YWAMers offered to drive it to Rhodesia, while I flew on to Johannesburg to meet with Brother Andrew. The campaign with Brother Andrew was an awe-inspiring experience. Every night, he spoke to capacity crowds of up to 8,000 in stadiums and public halls in each one of the 12 cities. Over the 2 weeks, around 50,000 people attended the meetings. Night after night, Brother Andrew stirred the congregation with the challenge to be involved in missions, and at every meeting, hundreds stood in response. In all, about 4,000 committed themselves. The campaign gave me an ideal opportunity to share about the training school that I was starting in Salzburg the following January. Many expressed interest and wanted to know more details. Typical of those inquiring was a young man named Logie, dressed in jeans, wearing an upmarket open shirt, and sporting a fashionable, slightly longer than usual hairstyle. Logie was what we would describe today as a yuppie. He was not the clean-cut young church person one would normally expect to recruit for missions. He responded, along with the scores of others, to Brother Andrew's call for salvation, coming forward at the end of the meeting in Cape Town. There was something about this young man in his mid-20s that made him stand out and drew me to him. "How can I help?" I said, going over and laying a hand lightly on his shoulder. "I don't know much about this Jesus stuff," he said, looking me straight in the eye. In fact, I would not be here if my friend hadn't dragged me along. His direct bluntness instantly attracted me to him. "So how did you enjoy the meeting?" I asked. "Well, it's certainly different from church, but there's reality in what the man spoke tonight, and I want it." He explained that what he needed was Jesus in his life, but before he could invite him in, he needed to turn from his sin. "I've led a pretty rotten life," he said with frank honesty. He explained how he'd been brought up in a middle-class family in South Africa, but had rebelled against his parents' values and way of life. "My aim has been to get ahead and make money. Heaps of it," he confessed. "I thought I was free and really going places, but lately I've begun to wonder." "True freedom can only be found in Christ," I responded. "Most of the people I mix with are phony and artificial. What I saw tonight was real," Logie replied. "That's what I want." "If you're willing to turn your back on your old way of life and accept the gift of salvation that Jesus gained for you through his death on the cross, then you can have it," I assured him. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Logie knelt down and in childlike simplicity gave his life to Jesus. He rose, smiling through his tear-stained face. I was convinced his conversion was genuine, but I also knew the pressures ahead and the temptations he would face to persuade him to return to his old life. "What do I do now?" he asked. "I'm starting a training school in Salisbury in January. If you came, it would help lay a solid foundation for your Christian faith." Logie seemed keen and took down the details. He was just one of many who had expressed interest in my Salisbury-based SOE. If everyone who inquired showed up, I would have well over 200 students. I still did not have the necessary finance or staff, but I was confident that the Lord would provide all I needed. Following the campaign in South Africa with Brother Andrew, I headed north to Salisbury to prepare for the school. By the time it was launched in January, I had 30 committed students, including the newly converted South African Logie. I wondered what had diverted the attention of the other 170 who had also shown such keen interest, but I thank God for those who signed up. I was especially grateful for the high caliber of students he had provided. They ranged in age from 18 to 30. A few were from Africa and Europe, but the majority came from white, middle-class South African and Rhodesian homes. But some, like Logie, had had their season of rebellion. The common factor that bound them all together was their zeal to serve Jesus Christ. When I started the school, I did not have any staff, so I recruited the more capable and mature students to help with administration and leading small groups. The 2,000 Swiss francs I had felt so essential to run the school never materialized. But in the end, I found it was not needed. The students' fees more than covered all our expenses, and with the Rest Haven's charges so minimal, we were able to hire a cook and another helper for washing up. This released the students from any duties and enabled them to concentrate on their studies. We had a number of visiting speakers, including Brother Andrew and my dad, while I took a large chunk of the teaching myself. The school had its difficulties. I quickly discovered that administration was not my strong point. Fortunately, I was able to have students assist in the areas where I was weak. Along with running the school, I continued our literature distribution throughout Africa, including our specialized outreach to the Chinese. During the campaign with Brother Andrew, I had also started a tape duplication ministry. Orders continued to come in from people who had either attended or heard about the campaign and wanted a cassette of Andrew's messages. But all this took time and commitment to do well, and I soon realized I had taken on more than I could personally handle. What I lacked in administrative skills, however, I was able to make up for in enthusiasm. Day after day, I was able to impart to the students my passion for missions. I shared about Roli and my adventure into Bulgaria, as well as the other Bible smuggling excursions I had taken into the Soviet Union. I told them about the unique doors of opportunities that had opened to the short-term teams in Africa. For example, our exposure on nationwide television in Uganda. Above all, I encouraged them not to limit God. One of the stories that had them on the edge of their seats was the account of a daring day trip that I had taken into the capital of a small spice island of Zanzibar 2 years earlier. A mere 80 kilometers long and 35 kilometers wide, Zanzibar lies 40 kilometers off the coast of Tanzania. Originally a British colony, Cuban-trained communists had taken over the island in a violent, bloody coup in 1964. Ian Muir, the Scottish accountant, made the initial foray. It was during that time when he and I were in Dar es Salaam, delivering our first batch of Red Chinese Gospels to Simon Malia. I had gone to visit the team in Zambia, so he decided to make a day trip on his own. He flew in from Dar es Salaam and boldly handed the Swahili translation of our yellow-bound children's book to kids on street corners. He came back so ecstatic at the response he had received that Simon and I made arrangements a few weeks later to make a follow-up visit ourselves. By this time, Ian had returned to Kenya to join the team there. Our journey got off to a shaky start. Confused about which plane we were to take, we almost missed our flight and only managed to scramble aboard the tiny craft minutes before takeoff. After an extremely turbulent 20-minute flight, we safely landed on the lush green island. The rich fragrance of vanilla and clove spices, the island's main export, hit our nostrils the moment we emerged from the plane. Then, carrying heavy shoulder bags full of literature, including copies of the Red Chinese Gospel, Simon and I hailed down a taxi. We were about to get in when two men stepped forward and stopped us. They were waving their hands and jabbering in Swahili. I looked questioningly at my Tanzanian companion. "What's the trouble?" "They won't let us go in the same taxi," Simon whispered. "Why?" "Because you are a foreigner. They're suspicious that you might be a spy." I could not understand what difference it made if we traveled together, but I was not in a position to argue. We quickly arranged to meet at the center of town at the famous Anglican Cathedral, Christ Church. A heavy depression settled on me as I traveled alone into the cathedral. I still felt shaken from a last-minute hitch in catching our plane, the turbulence of the flight, and then the confusion at the airport. The spiritual atmosphere seemed to be more oppressive than any country I had ever visited. This, I surmised, was due not only to its current communist regime, but also to his dark history of wealthy dictatorial sultans who had ruled in opulence and lived in palaces that could accommodate more than 100 concubines. Little over a century ago, Zanzibar had also been the clearinghouse for hapless slaves who had been captured from East African countries, shackled in irons, hoarded together like animals, and auctioned off to the highest bidder in the world's flourishing slave market. Dragging my heavy overnight bag from the back seat, I paid the taxi driver, glanced around to make sure I had not been tagged, and followed Simon, who had arrived in his taxi just before me, into the impressive Christ Church Cathedral. I was still puzzled by the scene at the airport. That issue never was resolved. My eyes adjusted to the dimness of the darkened interior. Because of its great historical and architectural significance, the cathedral had been allowed to continue functioning after the communist takeover. Simon and I had devised a plan. We would leave our bags here, and then, following Ian's example, take small bundles and distribute them around on the streets. We figured this would be our safest temporary distribution center on the island, and the Anglican priest the most sympathetic to our cause. We were in the process of looking for an inconspicuous place to leave our bags when an African priest approached us. "May I help you?" he asked in impeccable English. I extended my hand. "I'm Rudy Lack, and I'm with an organization called Youth of the Mission." Our times in Zanzibar was short, so I decided to take a risk and share openly with him the true purpose of our mission. His next words, however, stopped me short. "Well, I hope you're not here to try and evangelize. Just days ago, I had the secret police visit and accused me of distributing Christian literature. Some foolhardy person had been handing it out to the kids in street corners. They even had the gall to leave some here in the back pew." I gulped. Simon and I eyed one another. The priest turned and went over to a cupboard at the rear of the building and returned with a small package of our yellow-bound children's books, the very ones that were in our bulging bags at his feet. "Fools," he said, throwing the books with disgust on a nearby pew. "If only these people knew how much trouble they caused." We managed to mumble some words of commiseration, then quickly excused ourselves. Very thankful that we had not said anything to incriminate ourselves, we made a rapid retreat onto the street. That door closed. Now what do we do? Simon steadied himself against the cathedral's exterior stone wall. "Rudy, I don't feel very well." I looked at him in concern. "What's the problem?" I knew it could not be the heat. He was well used to the humid conditions in Dar es Salaam. "I feel really nauseous, and I have a splitting headache." "Let's find a place to sit and get a drink, Simon. Maybe that'll make you feel better." Sitting in the shade of a small roadhouse stand, we sipped from a bottle of Coke and discussed our next move. "Our only choice is to book ourselves into some cheap hotel and wait until dark to get rid of our books," Simon said. I agreed. The place was clearly crawling with secret police, and while Simon merged in with the populace, my white face stood out like a white sheep in the midst of a black flock. We found a cheap guest house called Zanzibar House, where we dumped our heavy bags safely in a wardrobe. We then spent the next few hours exploring the city, praying and checking out the best spots where we could make our night deliveries. Simon was unusually quiet. Although he did not complain, it was apparent that he was struggling with whatever was ailing him. Finally, in the late afternoon, he turned to me. "I can't make it, Rudy. I'm going to have to go back." I looked at him in disbelief. "What, to Dar es Salaam? I'm feeling too sick to keep going." "But what about the literature?" This was not the bold daredevil man I knew who was willing to face all odds to get the gospel out. I was sure his sickness did not have a physical cause, but was triggered by the extreme spiritual oppression of the place. "Let's pray. You'll be all right," I encouraged him, but Simon shook his head. "It's no good, Rudy. You stay on if you want, but I'm catching a taxi and taking a plane back." My stomach was in a knot. What was I to do now? Should I return with him and forget about trying to saturate Zanzibar with Christian literature? We were going to be hard-pressed as it was with the two of us trying to get rid of it all. How could I possibly manage to distribute it on my own? But the thought of taking even one of our books back undelivered was more than I could bear. "All right, Simon, you go, but I'm staying," he said. I bundled him into a taxi, and as it wove its way out of sight between honking cars, bell-ringing cycles, and even an occasional horse and cart, a wave of desperate loneliness overcame me. I spent the next couple of hours wandering forlornly through the dirt-packed city streets until, feeling tired and realizing that the need to reserve my strength for my night delivery, I retired to the dilapidated Zanzibar house. Sitting on a half-broken cane chair in the veranda, the island spice scent wafted in my nostrils. I looked out over the sea, waiting for the sun to set and darkness to take over, so that I could safely begin disposing of my literature. Eventually the sinking sun slipped from view under the horizon. Then, quickly packing as many books as I could into one of the smaller, less conspicuous shoulder bags, I went out into the dark, ill-lit alleys. I walked along, placing small piles on the raised stone ledges at the entrances of run-down ancient stone houses that backed right onto the street. An occasional gaslit street lamp was my only light. It cast an eerie shadow across the narrow, dirt-packed alleys, adding to the already spooky atmosphere. Soldiers with guns were positioned intermittently at street corners. As I crisscrossed the town, carefully depositing my books, I had never felt so petrified in all my life. I was already exhausted from the accumulated tension of the day, and every strange noise or unexpected footstep made me freeze. At any moment, I expected to hear one of the gun-toting soldiers shout, "Hey, you there, what are you doing?" What would I say? What would they do with me? Would they cast me into prison? Yet the sense of urgency to get all the books out kept me going. After 4 hours of crisscrossing the town, exhaustion finally overwhelmed me. I was so weary I could not take another step. But I still had a good number of books to deliver. I did not want to give up now. I decided, therefore, to take a few hours' rest. I worked out that if I woke at 4 a.m., I would have enough time to deliver the last of my books before sunrise. There was just one problem with this plan. I did not have an alarm clock. I could not risk asking the hotel to give me a wake-up call. That would arouse too much suspicion. But my feet were blistered and my back ached. I had no more energy to keep going. As I was supposed to deliver the rest of the books, then God himself, if I was supposed to deliver the rest of the books, then God himself would have to give me a wake-up call. As my head hit the pillow, I prayed, "Lord, you wake me at 4. I fell immediately into a deep sleep. I was so weary, I did not even dream. The next thing I remember was the penetrating crow of a rooster. I woke with a start and, fumbling for my watch, looked at the time. It was exactly 4 o'clock. Grabbed my small bag, I stuffed it with the remainder of the literature and crept out of the guest house door. For the next 2 hours, still under the cover of darkness, I continued to deliver my booklets, placing them in any crevice or on any suitable ledge I could find. I even daringly threw copies of a red-bound gospel over the high barbed wire stone fence that surrounded the Chinese embassy. By 6 o'clock, I had crisscrossed the city several times, and the sky's pale pink hue was signaling the start of a new day. Lacing the streets with the rest of my books, I littered them liberally between trees and along the roadside. I placed the final lot on a doorstep just as the sun's bright red streaks painted the sky, evaporating the darkness and exposing my night's clandestine delivery. As I hastily retreated to Zanzibar House, the city was already stirring to life. Soon people would emerge from their houses and spy my booklets. It had been a tough night's work, probably the most difficult assignment I had yet undertaken, and one I could easily have shirked. But as I noticed a few people spot the books, pick them up, and immediately begin to read, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had accomplished my part. Now it was up to God to complete the task. I looked around the SOE classroom of students who, sitting in the safety of Rest Haven Holiday Retreat, had been hanging on every word. "What happened to Simon Malay?" one of them asked. By the time the plane got back to Dar es Salaam, the nausea had lifted, and it never returned, I answered. "Which proves that his sickness probably did have a spiritual cause," one of the girls commented. "I believe so, and in fact, that was a key lesson both Simon and I learned that day. When we are about the Lord's business and get sick, it's crucial to find out the real cause. It may be physical. More often than not, however, what we are suffering is a direct satanic attack, and we need to push through. If we're willing to resist, there is no obstacle that we cannot overcome, just as there is no border that cannot be crossed," I said, bringing my lecture to a close and challenging them to a new level of commitment. All it takes is faith and a willingness to be used by God. Here in Rhodesia and South Africa, we have so many resources at our disposal. Yet, even in our neighboring northern nation of Zambia, there are communist Chinese working on the Tanzam Railway project who are being denied the gospel. It could be dangerous, but are you willing to take the risk and reach out to them with God's message of love? There were some vigorous nods and a few amens. A thrilling smile crossed Logi's face. "I'm ready, Rudi." I smiled at his willing enthusiasm. He was a different person from the ambitious, career-driven young man who had stood before me in Cape Town Stadium, tearfully giving his heart to Jesus Christ. In the last few months, he had eagerly absorbed all the teaching. His faith strengthened and matured. The driving motive of his heart now was to serve God, whatever the cost and whatever he might send him. Earlier in the school, he had approached me after lectures one day, greatly excited with what he believed was a word from God. The Lord's told me to go to Ethiopia, Rudy. I looked into his exuberant, faith-filled eyes. I did not want to dampen his zeal, but neither was I convinced he had really heard from God. Ethiopia was completely closed to South Africans. There was no way, humanly speaking, that he could cross that border. I was sure that he had not heard properly, but I did not want to discourage his faith, so I merely responded, "Maybe it's just a matter of time, Logie." Now, seeing his earnest response to my challenge, I realized it was time to release him, if not to Ethiopia, at least on an evangelistic outreach. Logie was not the only one who needed to be released. The lecture phase of the school was fast drawing to a close, and the 3-month practical outreach loomed ahead. All the students were like eager racehorses lined up at the starting gates, rearing to let go. But as I helped them load their gear into their assorted fleet of vehicles that ranged from students' private cars to our newly purchased second-hand Volkswagen van and even a pickup, I felt the pangs of an apprehensive father watching his children leave home for the first time. Could they cope? Had I prepared them adequately? The 3 teams were headed for the surrounding countries of Malawi, Zambia, and South Africa. I longed to split myself 3 ways and go with each team, but, of course, that was impossible. So I decided, at least initially, to join the team that faced the greatest potential risk, the team going into Zambia. I put a South African guy named Art over the team going to Zambia, a talented musician and guitarist. Art had led a number of street meetings during the lecture phase of the school. I felt confident he had the leadership qualities necessary. The 7 students, including my South African convert Logie, and I set off in our white Volkswagen. Instead of heading directly north to Zambia, however, we took a westerly route into the neighboring nation of Botswana. The newly independent black dictatorship of Zambia, led by Kenneth Kaunda, had no political relationship with the white-dominated democratic government of Rhodesia, led by Ian Smith, so the only way we could enter Zambia was through Botswana. On board were boxes of tracts, books, Bibles, and our yellow-bound children's book, and some of the latest 10,000 edition of the red-bound Chinese Gospels, hot off the press in Salisbury. While the Kenyan mission station at Kisumu continued to print and supply the northern African countries, it had become more practical to find a printer in Rhodesia who could supply the South. We joined up with the same mission organization that had previous short-term teams had worked with in the southern Zambian city of Lusaka. Our team was spread out among different missionary families. I was staying in a home with Art. A pattern similar to those developed by earlier short-term groups emerged. There were street meetings led by Art on the guitar, preaching at church services, and distribution of literature, both door-to-door as well as the markets. Art's singing and exceptional guitar skills opened doors in many school assemblies. As our group's reputation grew, more schools invited us to perform. During these 3 months, we sang, preached, and shared testimony before a captive audience of close to 30,000 Zambian school children. The greatest opportunity that presented itself, however, was the chance to attend the National Trade Fair at Ndola. In talking with the locals, I learned that this national event, held in the copper belt town of Ndola, drew thousands from around the nation. As I realized its significance, I got excited at the potential it offered us. Here was a unique chance to share the gospel and reach many lives for the Lord. We could distribute literature and engage in personal evangelism with people from all over Zambia. There was only one problem. Ndola was in an area where we had no contacts. It was a 5-hour journey north of Lusaka, and we would be gone for several days. I had no idea where to house the 8 of us. Our budget would not stretch to guest house or hotel accommodation, even a cheap one. Since coming to Africa, I had personally stayed in all kinds of places. I had slept under a haystack, in a stable, bedded down in hall corridors, slept on buses and train stations, and on one occasion even spent the night in a public bathroom. But while I did not mind roughing it myself, I did not feel that I could make the same demand of the 7 young Rhodesians and South Africans on our Zambia team. All of them came from good middle-class homes. Not one had likely experienced anything rougher than a tent camping holiday. Yet, it was such a wonderful opportunity. I pondered for several days about the possibility of going, but did not say anything to anyone. Now it had come to a point when, if we were going, we had to make a decision. The fair was the day after tomorrow, and Ndola was a half-day drive away, but this was not something I could decide alone. As student leader, Art needed to be involved in making the decision. With the two of us housed in the same missionary home, I took the opportunity that evening to raise the subject with him. What do you think, Art? We were standing outside enjoying the cooler, balmy, tropical night air. Evidently, thousands from all over the nation attend the trade fair. It's an amazing opportunity for evangelism. Yes, it would certainly be a unique experience, Rudy, but Art's voice trailed off. But what, Art? I guess he was tussling with the same issue that had concerned me, a lack of suitable accommodation. Do you know anyone in the area? He asked. I had to admit that I did not. So how are we going to house the 8 of us? Our budget won't stretch to paid accommodation. I've thought about that. The girls would probably have to sleep in the van and the guys out in the open. Art looked up at the night's brilliant array of stars. He slowly stroked his chin. I'm not sure, Rudy. I just don't know what to say. Let's put the idea to the rest of the team and see how they feel, I suggested. When we shared with the others the next day, they expressed the same reservations that Art had. Where will we wash? One of the girls quizzed. And how will we fix our meals? Another asked dubiously. Something will work out. You wait and see, I replied with a great deal more confidence than I actually felt. The students had been enthralled listening to my adventures of faith in the classroom. Now that it was time to take some steps of faith themselves, they were not so sure. Here's a chance to step out in God and really prove him, I said, seeking to stir their lagging spirits. If we aren't prepared to take risks, the Lord will never be able to prove himself to us. I knew that by encouraging them to go, I was stepping out on the ledge myself. But I was not prepared to pamper them. With some gentle prodding and more than a little gentle persuading, they all agreed, some reluctantly, that we should go as a team to the Ndola trade fair. What if we had to sleep in the Volkswagen and out in the open? I argued. It's not going to kill anyone. We left very early the next morning. By the time the 8 of us arrived in Ndola 5 hours later, the trade fair was already well underway. Held in an open field outside the town, there were hundreds of stands as businesses large and small displayed their wares. Some were under crudely erected plastic covers. Others had more sophisticated displays, while for some their stall was just a table in the open or some rags thrown on the dirt. As we had been correctly informed, many tens of thousands gathered for this national event. We drove our white Volkswagen into the midst of the milling African crowd, the largest I had ever seen, jumping out and quickly unloading our boxes of books, set up our own stall. Art grabbed his guitar and started strumming. The music and our white faces instantly grew a crowd. Books were scarce enough in Africa, but to get something for nothing was almost unheard of. As we sang, preached, and gave out free literature, everyone scrambled for our giveaway tracts and happily paid a few pennies for the more expensive books. Within hours, our total supply, except for some boxes of the Chinese Gospels, was depleted. It had certainly been worth taking the effort to come. I looked proudly at each student as they mingled with the crowd, their fair features standing out amongst a sea of black faces. Each had a small group around them and was involved in intense conversations. Using simple, comic-style tracts, they were expounding to these Zambians why they needed to put their faith in Jesus. Meanwhile, Art continued to strum his guitar. A couple of the team sang with him, and an ever-increasing number of black bodies pressed around to hear. The temperatures had soared. There was no shelter in the open area, barely even a tree. I had confidently told the team God would provide. Now, as I faced the reality of a mixed group of middle-class South Africans and Rhodesians sleeping in a van and under the sky in the open Zambian countryside, I was beginning to have second thoughts. Had I been foolhardy in persuading these raw recruits to attend the fair? I was standing by our van, struggling with my doubts, when a European, a total stranger, came over to me and smiled. Are you the leader of the group? I looked at him startled. I had not expected to see another white face in the sea of dark-skinned Africans. Yes, I'm Rudy Lack, and these are students on an outreach from our Youth of the Mission School in Rhodesia. Pleased to meet you, he said, extending his hand. I'm a missionary here in Ndola, and I've been watching these young people. I want to let you know how impressed I am with what you are doing. Thanks, I said. We talked for a few minutes, exchanging general pleasantries, and then he asked, and where are you all staying? We don't actually have anywhere to stay at the moment. We thought we'd just sleep out in the open. The man looked at me horrified as he eyed the young girls on our team. You can't do that, Mr. Lack. Not here in central Zambia. Come and stay with my wife and me. Our place isn't fancy, but we do have a big house. You're welcome to spend the night. I was staggered by his generous offer and from a complete stranger. Are you sure? Honestly, it'll be fine. My wife and I would love to have you, he assured me. A weight lifted from my shoulders. Thank you. Thank you very much. Once again, in spite of my wavering faith, God had proved himself. From a few days' visit to a trade fair, the group's outreach in Ndola extended into a couple of weeks. The missionary introduced us to other churches in the area. Ministry opened up, and the team decided to stay on. I left after we had been in Ndola a couple of days and returned to Salisbury, where a skeleton staff had been carrying on the tape duplication and book distribution ministry. By now, we had acquired an office sharing third-story premises in the same downtown block as the Methodist minister Gary Strong had his office. After 3 months of outreach, the teams reported back to the Rest Haven holiday retreat. As their vehicles drove in, they sported a few more dents, and their occupants' faith had also been stretched to the hilt. Yet, despite difficult and often testing times, the students' enthusiasm remained high, and their zeal for God unabated. I listened, my father's chest swelling as one by one my kids told how the Lord had provided for them and led them every step of the way. In true pioneering spirit, the team to Zambia had made a side excursion to the Congo, where no other Weimer had ventured. Art's remarkable talent on the guitar had paved a way for the Zambian group to perform on national television. But what really made my mouth drop was Art's report on what happened after I had left them in the copper-belt town of Ndola. Rudi so inspired us with his vision for the communist workers on the Tanzam Railway project that since we were in the area and had boxes of Chinese Gospels with us, we decided to take them to the camp ourselves, he explained. Now is my turn to sit on the edge of my seat. With the boldness and seeming foolhardiness of youth, they had taken no precautions but just rolled up to the camp's barbed wire and started giving out books to the African workers. They gave them some in English and said, "Here's some for you to read." And then they gave the red Gospels and said, "Here's some for you to give to the Chinese." I was staggered by the simplicity of the strategy. "And they just took them?" I asked. "Yep," Art grinned. They seemed more than happy and quite willing to hand them on to the communist workers. These young students had gone further and been even more daring than I had. It stirred me to greater boldness and rekindled my own burden for the Chinese communist workers in Zambia and Tanzania. Lord, open the way for me to take another trip and deliver more gospels to the Chinese, I prayed. It would be another year, however, before God would answer my heart's cry. All right, well, thank you very much for tuning in to Chapter 12 of Rudy Lack's book, Breaktrhrough. We will continue next week with Chapter 13, which is called Black and White Do Mix. So we'll be interested to see how that goes. So the Missionary Coach Show podcast is value for value. I work full-time volunteer missions in Youth of the Mission. So I get all of our support through donors and through people that choose to partner with us in ministry. So if that's something you want to do, head over to missionarycoach.org, where you can see how you can partner with us financially or in prayer. You can also subscribe to our newsletter over there, and you can also subscribe to this show so that you can keep reading with us as we finish reading Rudy Lack's book. So again, thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to catching you next time. I've been producing the YM News Show since 2010. It's grown from a fortnightly audio podcast of about 15 minutes long to an audio and video news show that's streamed live on the last Thursday of every month on many video and podcast platforms. Every episode can be found at ympodcast.com, with the videos starting in November of 2022. The preparation and production for each episode takes about 2 weeks of news gathering, video and audio editing, recording and streaming, and post-production work. This usually involves sorting through over 400 articles, hundreds of videos, and many social media posts to try to figure out what is happening in Youth of the Mission at our over 1,200 different operating locations. Next month, we'll be expanding further and bringing in a co-host and other contributors to the show. This will be exciting as it'll introduce new perspectives to the show, and hopefully we'll find stories that I haven't been aware of or haven't come across. So moving into this new phase involves a lot of work and challenges and changes. I'd appreciate your prayers and support moving into this, as my workflow is dramatically changing. There are a lot of technical issues to overcome, and I likely have additional expenses to help with the extra workload. If you head over to winepodcast.com, you can check out all of the latest shows and all of them all the way back to 2010. And if you go to billhutchison.org, you can find out how you can support and partner with me as we move forward into this new phase of ministry.